Good afternoon, everybody, I want to thank Hillel for chairing the panel. I want to thank Ephraim Karsh, who is my former doctoral advisor and led to my work on UNRWA and to my book ultimately, and really being a part of this distinguished panel, all people that I've worked with and in the space of UNRWA over the years. As a segue from the report, from Alex's comments that I will tie on related to our report, I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of the member donor states that have been involved with UNRWA that lead really to the challenge and the anomaly of UNRWA at large. One of the groups that Alex mentioned, which was part of our book, was the American Friends Service Committee, the AFSC, the Quakers, who had responsibility for Gaza for about 16 months in 1949. There was a famous observation that took place there in the fall of 1949 when the Clapp Commission visited that refugee camp, and they were met with a famous slogan, and I quote here. It was a large sign printed in English, and the numbers indicated: number 1, send us back; number 2, compensate us; number 3, maintain us until we are refreshed. In many ways, that has become the embodiment of UNRWA today. This was something that was made in 1949 under the Quaker responsibility of the Arab Palestinian refugees in Gaza back then. If you go forward since the 1960s, if you look at American lawmakers, there has been an ongoing conversation and debate about what to do about UNRWA as it relates to its contributions. In 1960, there was basically later on, a conversation that led to the Section 301C of the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961 that talks about UNRWA's ties to terrorism. And the language there was very clear: no contributions by the United States shall be made to UNRWA except on the condition that UNRWA takes possible measures to assure that no part of U.S. contributions shall be used to furnish assistance to any refugee who receiving military training as a member of the so-called Palestine Liberation Army or any other guerrilla-type organization who has been engaged in an act of terrorism. That has framed a lot of the contributions as trying to prevent monies that have gone to UNRWA. As far as it relates to terrorist activity, clearly there has been a great deal of problematic issues when it comes to money that has gone from Congress to UNRWA, as far as trying to figure out where the money is going and are those monies tainted. It is even more complicated today as it relates to the current configuration of the Palestinian Authority and the ties between the PA and Hamas at large. But you've seen this ongoing conversation about trying to deal with that. In the 1970s, you saw congressional resolutions that have sought to cut off and limit UNRWA to the PA. American legislators have tried to introduce appropriation bills and trying to deal with looking at terrorism and educational materials that I'm sure my colleague Arnold Gross will talk about later as it relates to the textbooks. But these are all part of the symptoms of the larger issue of the ties to terrorism. Interestingly enough, as it relates to the bipartisanship related to American foreign policy, one of the first people to actually introduce and question the functionality of UNRWA was back in 2002 by the late Tom Lantos. Lantos was the only Holocaust survivor in the House, and Lantos had an entire back and forth with then Secretary General Kofi Annan. And Lantos wrote then, and I quote, UNRWA officials have yet to follow and failed to prevent their camps from becoming centers of terrorist activity, but they've also to create any kind of development. Annan's reply to Lantos at the time was that the United Nations has no responsibility for security matters in refugee camps or indeed anywhere else in the occupied territory. Again, there's a total absolving any kind of activity and centrality within the camps themselves. By the way, when UNRWA and UNRWA officials go to Congress and ask for money every year, which they do on a consistent effort, the language has pretty much been consistent. We take care of the betterment of Palestinian refugees and write us a check. That has been the largest problem that we've faced with UNRWA over the years, and all the research that I've done and Alex has done by trying to even get some kind of sense of audit in the sense of where the monies have gone. And actually, if they can't even tell you exactly how many laptops, how many pencils they've got, it's very hard to do any of that at large. To that end, what we saw by former U.S. Congressman, then Senator Mark Kirk, related to the issue of the audit issues, changing the language and the legislation to limit Palestinian refugees. And again, the Kirk language was very precise in trying to create definitions of American aid to UNRWA to be specified in a memorandum of understanding, and the draft was to actually change, which is the related to the definition of a Palestinian refugee. The current definition talks about a Palestinian refugee is defined as a person whose place of residence was Palestine between June of 46 to May of 1948, who was personally displaced as a result of 48 or 67 in the Arab-Israeli conflicts, who currently does not reside in the West Bank or Gaza, and was not a citizen of any other state. That latter part of the definition is what's missing from the conversation in order to try to suppress and cut down of the growth of the number of refugees. Again, that is part and the parcel of the challenge of UNRWA. UNRWA, in these political conversation, is asking more money based on the so-called growth of the number of refugees because of the anomaly in which Arab Palestinian refugees are defined and the lineage component that is only unique to Arab Palestinian refugees. The U.S. officials, and in particular Mark Kirk in his day, tried to suppress those very issues. On May 24th, in the U.S. Senate, basically passed the Kirk amendment, and part of the $52.1 billion in 2013, the State Department and the Foreign Appropriations Bill said it was critical to understand that Kirk and company are not calling for the elimination of benefits, but are just challenging exactly who is an actual refugee. Pragmatically, the bill is just challenging the hereditary status of Palestinian refugees and thereby the target of UNRWA's audience. Of course, as a result of that, UNRWA has always shut this down. To show you again how, and over the past kind of moving forward to what we've seen over the past few years under the Obama administration, there has been a total suppressing of dealing with UNRWA issues at large. Back in 2015, the State Department ratified under the Obama administration what was known as the Framework of Cooperation between the UNRWA and the United States, and that was a kind of a repetitive action against exposing UNRWA's, not exposing to say the least, UNRWA's unsavory and illegal activities. All they did was, and within the bulk of the document, was that there are objectives as far as medium-term strategies, development of strategic responses of each of UNRWA's field, continued implementation of ongoing management reforms, and particularly trying to resource mobilization, human resources. And again, all of this is part of the reflection of UNRWA's professionalism. The State Department back in 2015 and still a lot of other circles within the State Department today talked about the fact that UNRWA is still a vital agency in order to protect the valuability of Arab Palestinian refugees. And again, what's even more fascinating about this document is, again, they talk about the ongoing continued existence of UNRWA. Again, there was no checks and balances, there was no any kind of measures to kind of say what UNRWA does. The objective is to see whether or not UNRWA is actually achieving its objectives or whether it has ties to any of this. And by the way, this was after Israel went into Gaza back in 2014. Again, none of this is mentioned at all in the conversation as far as the goal of what the State Department should be doing. Actually, they talk about the fact that the goal of the United States is to support UNRWA to ensure the Palestinian refugees' lives in dignity, to enhance with human development and potential comprehensive and a just solution secured. Again, this kind of amorphous language has been the continuation of the ongoing support on these very issues. As you go forward, again, you talk about other countries who've been involved, and I think it's also worth noting to that regard are countries, Western countries like the Canadians. Back in 2010, Canada became the first Western country, the first one of the Western donors to defund from UNRWA. And specifically interesting, when it came to the Harper government at the time, interestingly enough, the validation for defunding of UNRWA back in 2010 was based on an EU report of all issues related to the incitement within Arab Palestinian textbooks that were taught within UNRWA schools. And as a result of that, the Canadian government decided to defund from UNRWA, only give money to PA projects in particular where they could get some kind of accountability and transparency, but take away the money from UNRWA at large. By the way, at the time, Canada was giving in the tone of about $25 million to these very issues. Now, unfortunately, even what was true back in 2010 is still true today, but here we are after the Harper government and Canada once again re-upped. And so we see this again, the continuation of this status and this ongoing desire to help and move this along. My time is short, I know, based on my chair, but let me add a few more points on this very issue as it relates to trying to look at solutions and where we are as it relates to the state of Israel. You have these Western donors who are giving a lot of money under the perception that these very issues are going to maintain Palestinians and what actually helps individuals who are fleeing for their lives. There is what I would consider to be within the refugee mentality, within particularly Western donors, a cognitive dissonance as it relates to specific issues. The perception is that we need to help them, in particular in the United States. As a result of that, we give these large sums of money without any kind of accountability and transparency. Now, what's interesting about the current environment to kind of bring us to where we are now, we're seeing a kind of a shift in that narrative, which I think is an opportunity for us under what we've seen now under the current Trump administration as a result of Haley's comments, as a result of the good work that my colleague Einat Vilf has done here in Israel. There is a kind of an opening, I think, in a tandem way to look at the United States and Israel trying to move this along. State of Israel, I won't spend much time on what the State of Israel has done in this regard, but it's been a love-hate relationship. There's been a kind of a catch-22 in this regard. The perception for many, many years has been in the State of Israel that if UNRWA does not take on these responsibilities or maintain these issues, it's going to be Israel's problem. So while Israel does not contribute monetarily, Israel has not supported to defund UNRWA at large. So now there might be an opportunity to change that. As it relates to, I think, again, these next steps that need to be looked at very carefully. As we mentioned in our report, I think that any kind of change or shift within the Palestinian Authority, and as far as strengthening the Palestinian Authority at large, if that is the future, cannot happen without suppressing or moving UNRWA at large without getting them out of the environment at large. I have argued for years, and I think it's still true today, that UNRWA has basically become a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. That needs to change and shift in order to professionalize and to kind of move this along. The other thing that I would recommend, that we've recommended in our report, is of course ongoing local resettlement within the countries where there are Arab Palestinian refugees within those current states in order to change that environment and reduce the numbers. Those are really the basic issues that need to change. And of course, in addition to all of that, with the hope that if these things change, then the Western donors that are contributing to this enterprise, which has been going on for now over 7 decades, will actually change and we can make some kind of dent. So on that note, I thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to the questions later on. Thank you very much.